Okay, I wanted to make a part two with this video and talk about determining the domain and range of these of these graphs. Okay, so just a quick reminder that domain is where you have x values. So x values. Okay, and I often ask my question, where do I have x values? Okay, and then the range is simply your y values. Okay, so that's your y values. All right, and I ask myself the same question, where do I have y values? Okay, so what I want to do is take a look at this graph and talk about how I can identify the domain and range. Now, if I'm talking about the domain, all right, so let me say my domain here. Okay, and then over here I'll put range, so D and R, okay? And if I'm talking about domain, okay, I go from left to right, all right? So domain, we go from left to right, okay? Where do I start and where do I stop, okay? And what I want to do is kind of take a look at this and I'm just going to start here, with my graph. All right, so if I start here, and that's where my graph starts. Now notice that I have an arrow on this graph that's pointing down. Okay, meaning that if this arrow exists, this graph is going to go forever and ever and ever to the left. Okay, and then similarly, if I go and do it for the right side, I have an arrow that goes all the way up. Okay, so in this case, what I have is this. All right, it means I start on the left from negative infinity, and I have points on this graph that go all the way to the right. Okay, so that's what's going on. Okay, and so my domain in this case would be all real numbers. Okay, and the same thing happens with the range of this graph. If I go and I look and I say, okay, with the range, I go from the bottom to the top. So bottom to the top. Where do I start? Where do I end? Okay, and so what I'm looking for is where do I start? Okay, so if I look at my very bottommost point, notice how I have this arrow that's going to go down, and this graph is going to go down forever down to negative infinity. Okay, so if I look at that graph, that part right there, okay, that's where I look, and then where does it stop? Okay, and what's going to happen is if I start down low, all right, I have points on this graph that are going to continue up to the entire, to positive infinity. Okay, so range is all real numbers here. Okay, so it might be a little confusing to you. And what I want to do is kind of think about this. All right, what you have on this graph is you have a series of points. Okay, and those points are going to be all over this graph. Okay, and each of these points contain an x value and a y value. Okay, so each of those contain an x and a y. Now, what I have, what we need to understand is that, where do I have y values? Like, what can I say about all those y values? Well, those y values would continue on and go down to negative infinity if I extended this graph out. And same thing up here with positive infinity. Okay, that graph would go up. Okay, so all my y values, I would have every single y value on this graph. And so that's why I have all real numbers. Same thing with my domain. Okay, those are my x values. On this graph, at every point on this graph, I have an x value. And I'm describing where do those x values exist. Okay, and those x values would be, all real numbers because we go down to negative infinity and positive infinity. Okay, so this graph will contain every single x value and every single y value. Now on part B, okay, this one's a little bit different. Okay, if I'm talking about my domain, okay, and let's just call this value here, let's just say that this is a circle with radius 3. So a circle with radius 3, okay. And so this would be the point -3 down here. This would be the point 3 here. The y value would be -3 down there, and up here it'd be +3. Okay, so what I want you to see is that, there are a series of points on this graph. Okay, now remember, this is not a function, okay, but I can still talk about the domain of this graph. Okay, and so all these points are going to be between 0 or -3 and 3. Okay, and so if I kind of shade that in, all right, I'm going to start at -3, and that's going, to extend all the way to 3. Okay, and that's where that stops. Okay, now if I wanted to talk about the range, all right, let's talk about what the domain is. So going from left to right, what I would want to say in this case is that we start at -3, and we include -3, and that's going to go all the way to +3. Okay. Now, if I wanted to say that in interval notation, we'll talk more about interval notation, I would give that the brackets, and I would say from -3 to +3. Okay. If I wanted to say, talk about my range, all right, going from the bottom to the top. Now, where do I start? Now, I start down here at -3, all right, and all the points that are on the graph are between -3 and +3. Okay, so I would shade all the way up to +3. Now, you don't have to shade this. I'm just trying to show you a visual as to what you're doing. So all the points are going to exist between -3 and 3. So my range, what I would say, is that we go from -3, less than or equal to, and that's going to be my y value, okay, and that's going to be less than or equal to +3. Okay, in interval notation, we would call this -3 bracket +3. Okay. Now down over here, if I wanted to show in interval notation what this would be for this graph, if I say all real numbers, that means I use parenthesis -infinity to +infinity. Okay, same thing with the range. I would say -infinity to +infinity. So these points, you will see this, we've talked about it a little bit, just talking about functions and, identifying where do you have x values, where do you have y values. But we also need to look at a graph and be able to do it that way. So hopefully this helps. Go ahead and get started on your homework, and we'll see you in a bit. And holler if you got any questions. Thanks a lot. Bye.